Good afternoon and welcome back to our COVID-19, the Mason Impact class. We are on Tuesday and we've had a successful first week and a great presentation yesterday, and I'm excited to have everybody back today. A few class announcements for you. One is a reminder that as you're doing your responses to the prompts after the presentations, maybe I'll go back to remind you that one of the best ways to prepare is to, on the day of the presentation, go in, look at the day's information in the My Mason area, look at the biography of the person you're going to be hearing from, look at the prompts that you're going to be asked, and then go and look at the preparatory material, because the preparatory material is clearly important for what people are talking about in their presentations. Then after the talk, you write your response. When you're writing your response, one of the things we're getting consistent questions about is how to cite. We've got two things in the FAQs over on the side on the Blackboard page where you can get more information. A reminder that what we're really looking for is to make sure that you're separating what you're hearing in the talk and then what your response is personally. So if you're quoting from one of the things you had as preparatory material or from the speaker themselves, you can reference that directly. So you can say, as Dr. Cronin said today, and reference that. You don't have to put a bibliography. If you then pull in something that you read in the New York Times that you want to compare it to, then you'd want to put a short citation at the end, pointing us to where you saw the additional information. But more details on that, if your grades are up for last week, and more details on that are there, and they'll direct you to the FAQs if there's an issue with that. The only other thing I would want to point out is just a reminder, one more time, a reminder, everybody's getting acculturated into this, but if you've got questions for us about how the class is going or details you want to ask the TAs, use the chat. Y'all did a fabulous job on this last time. Use the Q&A section to be able to type in questions for the speaker. You can type at any time while they're talking. I'm curating those questions. Sometimes I won't ask your question word for word because there'll be 6 of similar questions, and I want to make sure that our guest speaker has a chance to talk about as many of the kinds of topics we're talking about, but I'm reading all of them. We're trying to approach as many of them as we can. It also helps when you vote up questions. So you're like, I have a question like that. And I'm actually really enjoying watching in there when you're also responding to each other, when you're saying yes and this. So, so make sure you're paying attention to that as you're paying attention to the speaker. So with that, I'd like to introduce our speaker today. So Dr. Matt Cronin is Associate Professor of Management. Matt's also a really good friend of mine from the first year I got at Mason. And he is the most creative thinker in, I think, the School of Business. There may be some argument. He may arm wrestle people over that idea. But Matt really does take a broad view of looking at how people respond. And if you look at the post today, you'll probably get a different idea than what you thought you would be getting if you were looking at a management paper about responding to COVID. It's a much broader view on how you can be creative in your response. So with that, and I think it ties really well to what we've been hearing before about how people are reacting, and especially as we even think about yesterday's talk about the rhetoric around this and how people have responded with fear and are not thinking critically about the information they're getting, rather than being able to take a step back and thinking about that. So if you sort of take that and transform it and think what Matt's talking about, that'll help actually frame more of what Dr. Lawrence was talking about last time. So with that, Matt, I'm going to hand it over to you, and I look forward to hearing from you.
Thanks. I'm going to share my screen, and you all can see that, right? All right, cool. So I am Matt Cronin, as Bethany said, and getting the gist of this. I actually don't use slides most of the time when I talk, so, but this is a whole new world, and so here we are. All right, so anyway, I've got a PhD in organizational behavior from Carnegie Mellon and a master's in developmental psychology from Columbia. That's sort of how I got started. But I was always interested in creativity, even from, I would say always, right? It's just that as time has progressed, I've gotten to think a lot more about how to actually make it work. I also study conflict, and the actual connection there is that if you want to get anything creative accomplished, there will be conflict, and that conflict needs to be managed. Ironically, if you have conflict, the best way to get over it is with creativity. That is actually the soul of effective negotiation. So that's how those two things work. And they both relate to my more general interest, which is collaboration. So while I am an academic and mostly am interested in sort of cognition and thought, I try and use that to help collaboration. So this is a picture of the replacement hospital at Fort Leonard Wood. There was just the groundbreaking of this, and you can see Major General Donna Martin talking about it. I'm a part of this project in helping the construction groups understand how to sort of stay on time and on budget by improving their collaboration. And I do this in partnership with University Research Institute, which is started by a group of folks who did sort of architectural work on the built environment. So I'm very interested in how we think and collaborate in order to solve problems. Now, I suppose I should tell you some other fun facts. I have lots of guitars. That's my daughter when she was younger, by the way. You can see those guitars and some of the guitars in the room behind me. And I also have lots of cats. So it's my wife in bed with, believe it or not, not all of them. So there's no way to say I have 8 cats, not sound crazy, but here we are. Anyway, speaking of my wife, she used to be a stonemason. So this is my daughter in front of the very first thing she ever carved, which is a giant fountain. And she did this work for a long time, but then when we came here, she got sick with something called idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis. And that's caused her to need 3, count them, 3 lung transplants. This is actually her, as she was waiting for her third, and listening to my daughter play her violin out in the little courtyard. So this is her after she got her third, learning to walk. So, you know, not a sad story, you know, like we're very happy, you know, everything has been all right. But this, even the idea of lung transplantation and her being like getting 3 of them shows you the kind of difficult problems that exist in the world that people are trying to solve. They're what you would call wicked problems. And we have a lot of them, right? Including COVID, right? So a wicked problem is one that we define as having innumerable causes. It's tough to describe and it doesn't have a right answer. And although COVID has parts of it that are kind of more systematic and easy to describe, like what actually happens to you physiologically, it also leads to lots of other problems, right? Like how do we educate people? What do we do with the kids? How do we keep the markets up? And what do we do about the people who really need to have their employment not tank and also need to learn a little bit about what facts are, but that's a different thing altogether. Anyway, so what I'm going to talk to you about today, while I write about creativity, right, the mistake most people make is to think of creativity as like some wild, far out thing, like as a talent that some people have that brings magical new ideas to them, when in fact, creativity and the solutions that are creative require what I'm calling balanced thought. Now, you all read about that, right? There's, the artist is a piece of that triangle, right? You also need scientific and judgmental thought. And this actually works when you start by thinking, okay, I've got a problem. What's going on here? How does it actually work? Then when you understand how it works, you think, well, what could we do? Which a part of that is knowing what we know how to do already, but also a part of it is thinking about what might be possible, but we can't do yet. And when you know that, you can begin to envision how an approach to this problem might change. And with that, you can try and actually get it to work, you know, understand what may be feasible. After you understand what's feasible, after you go through that whole thing, then you can think about what should we do, right? So this is a process and it emerges over time. You don't think as one of these people, you think of all of them. And the person who's in the lead, or the role, as I'm calling it, that's in the lead, changes over time, right? That's why I have this as a spiral. So that's what I'm going to talk to you a little bit about today. Right? So the cycle is that, you know, you sort of need to know how things work. which is scientist thinking, to imagine, artists, how they might be improved. And improvement is judgment, right? What do we want to have happen? Yet even when a new approach, artist, solves your problem, scientist, it has to be seen as appropriate, right? People who don't, they may think something is workable, but just not the right thing to do. And that will be a problem if you intend to sort of move forward. And then similarly, how we would like things to be is subservient to how they actually work. But with the right perspective, we can align our needs with the world, right? So, and now I'm going to take a second and look at these questions. Yes, I am the author of the SAJ article, and it was written. It's continually being written and rewritten. I use it in my classes, and I also am going to answer that I don't think I get to decide whether you get to see one of my cats. At some point, a cat is going to interrupt what I am doing, either by climbing that pole behind me or by sitting on my lap and demanding my attention until I throw it off. So I'm not in command of that particular choice. All right. So a couple of people have, all right, now the questions are pouring in, and now Bethany's prediction of, yeah, I'm going to get lost in these is right. So I'm going to continue on, but there's a lot of good ones I see about media and being raised to think inside the box. So hopefully I'll answer some of these, but if not, we'll get to them more at the end. All right. So let me explain like how it should work if the scientist, artist, judge, balanced thinking works, right? We start with something like, how does COVID spread? Now that's mostly a scientist question, right? Because there's a way in which that works, but to really discover it also is going to require you being kind of clever to figure out, again, we can't see it spreading, right? You can't be like, hey, my friend has COVID over here, stand about 6 feet away, he's going to cough, and then we'll see you in 2 weeks. All right, you 5 feet, okay, no, right? Like there's judgment and scientific thought to understanding that problem. Whereas something like what is acceptable risk, that's one where the judge is driving, right? We have to sort of think according to the society we want to live in, right? What do we think is okay? Is it all right, if we let people get sick, right? If they have COVID parties or whatever they're doing. Is it all right if we say, hey, listen, you can go out and you can interact with others, but, here are the risks that you assume that we can't help you with if things go south, right? When we know that, something like how could people interact safely, right, which is where this goes back to, there you begin to get more artisty, right? Because we have to sort of be able to think not just what can we do now, but what might we do? So all of these boxes, inform each other, right? Each one is a decision point that's part of a problem that connects with a lot of different sources of information, and we try and think, what actually works here, right? Why do people not wear masks when they should, right? How much should we force them? Is there any other way we can maybe align incentives so it doesn't seem so bad to wear masks, right? Those are the sorts of kinds of things that should be all working together as we over time try and solve the problem. Unfortunately, this is more often how it works, which is we make a decision, hold on, we make a decision. So, all right, what you were supposed to say is that, then this, right? We make choices and we just don't think about the long-term impacts because we think narrowly, right? And so I just put up a bunch of my favorite, sort of single-minded thought ideas here, right? Zoom fixes everything. That's wonderful, Zoom's awesome. I don't know how many of you guys have had like Zoom dinners. We did that twice, and then we were like, all right, that was fun enough, right? The herd immunity, I love that one. Herd immunity is a solution, right? Like we that was around in 1918. We can't think of anything better. Anyway, these are all the sorts of ways that, like in the article I said, these are lousy solutions that come because people think we should be able to just sort of come up with one answer using our role of choice. And that really is problematic. But now let's really look into why does that actually happen, right? I think the first problem is what I'm going to call hijacking by one role, right? Every person sort of has a natural predilection for a particular style. And so we want to use that one to sort of do everything, right? I probably unsurprisingly, like my default style is artist, right? I tend to think outside the box about things. That's good, but those ideas have to work, right? And even though that's my favorite, it can't be the only one I use. So the three, as I think about them, one is leading with the judge. Those are the people who only want to think about what they think should happen, right? That's what what should happen is how we should think, and we go forward from that. And I'll talk about each of these, but I just want to give you an overview. There's some people who overextend the scientist, right? They feel like we just get more information and suddenly everything is clear. And then of course there are people who kind of either don't use the artist at all because they think it's frivolous, or they overuse the artist and think that the novel solution will save us. So let's dig into those a little bit more, because what I want you to do, I want you to be able to do, is to recognize when you were falling into one of these traps. So a different kind of trap thinking, which we hear a lot about, are called heuristics and biases, right? Daniel Kahneman has made a career talking about these with Amos Tversky, the late Amos Tversky, right? The kinds of mistakes we make where the things that we can remember more quickly, we think are more likely to happen. They're very robust and they're very hard to get rid of. And that's the reason I'm talking about this. Daniel Kahneman, the discoverer of these, the studier of these, still falls victim to them. So what I'm going to say is you may fall victim to these too. So what I'm hoping to do is equip you with the capability to say, hey, wait a minute, I'm leading with the judge. I should stop that. What do I do instead? So let's talk about each of these. Okay, leading with the judge means you let your morality get in the way. This is the road to hell is paved with good intentions mistake, right? So we confuse what is good with what is correct or what is accurate. What we wish to have happen, we think, is the way the world should work. And sometimes our judge can even intrude from different problems. The reason this is because the judge is a very, 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 very old role, probably the oldest of the three we have. Animals have a judge. Animals instinctively are like, that's dangerous, I should avoid it. That, I need that, I'm gonna go get it, right? And so it's a very powerful function, but again, it gets in the way. So I'll give you an example. Social justice is something that we're all concerned with, or we should be at least. However, I was one time at a conference talking about sustainable cities and the importance of trees for cities, trees and parks, right? In the blink of an eye, we went to trees and parks are important for cities because they help the air quality, to people who are in marginalized societies, don't get to use parks and are abused and have been wronged and in the past. And I'm like, yo, we were just talking about getting trees in the city. Like, I agree with the problem, but that's not the one we're working on right now, right? So the problem is when you do that, the artist and the scientist are shut down. I've heard the term for this is cancel culture, right? Because when somebody says, yes, I do agree with the end you want, like to help with this problem, but I don't think your solution might work. The judge response is, you are questioning my morality. You don't believe that we should have social justice. Something must be wrong with you, right? And that shuts down any kind of growth or understanding. Similarly, if you're the person who really does believe in something, you tend to co-opt the scientist and the artist to rationalize whatever you think should happen, right? Which means looking only at a narrow set of data, or only at the cases that support you and ignoring the cases that don't, and then making elaborate stories for why your version of reality is the right one. So it fundamentally limits thinking and imagination and can destroy collaboration. And I'll give an example in just a second. Actually, yeah, let me continue on. The second thing is to overextend the scientist, which is sort of thinking that all we need to do is find the answer. And I kind of call this Google thinking, right? You can find answers out there for everything, pretty much, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean it's the right answer for you, right? And the problem is when we think, well, I just need to find the answer, it's out there, you don't actually use your judge to say, yeah, I know that solution worked for another set of people. Does it work for us, right? Should it work for us? And this is a problem because as you gather more information, it actually makes the problem more difficult to solve, right? And similarly, as you gather more information, your artist who has to figure out what to do becomes overwhelmed with possibility, because people mistake, they can mistake what is rare for what is creative, or they can just not know what to do with all that's there. So this can lead to sophomore thought and pseudo creativity. So let me give you an example, because I feel like we need one. Mason is thinking, far be it for me to criticize my employer, but Mason is thinking we all need to come back, we want to find a way to get people back onto campus, right? So what does that mean we do? So how does someone lead with the judge? Well, they might lead with the judge by saying, well, you know what, like, we just need to get people the information, right? And because getting access is really what matters. We have to make sure there's access. And so we're going to have asynchronous classes and obvious access to everybody. And they're not really thinking about, will that work and how will that work, right? Or they may think, well, what are other universities doing? And they may look to other, all kinds of other universities to see what they're doing. But we're Mason. Mason is a specific place, right? Mason has a specific student body. It has a particular style of education. It's very diverse, right? Which means that's not just lip service. It means that people have a lot of different backgrounds, right? And that makes us particular. So we shouldn't just decide what we should do. We should figure out what we actually need, that scientist, and then figure out how to give it to them in a way that works, which is judge. All right. The other thing that people can make a mistake is to sort of stereotype the artist. And again, because when people hear creativity, they think music and they think, dance, and they think pictures, and they think aesthetics, right? They don't see creativity as the sort of engine of discovery, which is really what it is. Unfortunately, then when they learn that it's the engine of discovery, they think we just need a silver bullet idea and we'll be perfect. We just need to know exactly, like, find the aha, and then all will be revealed to us, right? And that doesn't work that way either, because creativity takes a long time to emerge, right? Nothing ever worked the first time anyone had an idea about it, okay? And so when you think you're going to have a silver bullet idea, right? Well, first, if you think that creativity is just for the, for the aesthetic, you don't think about being creative at all. But then when you're like, no, creativity will save us, and you expect it to happen in an aha, then when you get an aha that's not fully formed, you abandon it prematurely. And a lot of really good ideas go by the wayside that way. All right, so now let's get to some more examples, right? Leading with the judge. We have to open stores because the economy will suffer, right? This is a person whose only imagination for how the world could work is determined by this commitment to this particular idea, and it prevents us from thinking about security. And by the way, I'm not saying we can't try and do something with this idea, right? Let's find a way to open the economy, but certainly we can't just sort of assert that it must be that way, and so on we go, march forward, right? Overextending the scientists, right? You have people who make rules for socially distanced kindergarten. I mean, this is like, for all of us who have children in the Fairfax County school system, right? They have all kinds of rules that they're going to put into place. Whether children will comply, well, you must not have any interaction with any if you think they're going to comply with the way you think they are. All right. And then, of course, like I said, stereotyping the artist, the university wants to be creative about how it responds to COVID. But pretty much what we're getting is a lot of the same old, right? Some universities are like, yeah, well, just, business as usual. It's fine. People will separate, right? That's not inventive. Or, hey, we'll just all do everything online. That's not particularly inventive either, right? And so we want to be able to get out of these. And actually, the way we get out of them is to use the other roles to help each other. So one of the things I talked about is that each of the different roles sort of struggles with a different feature, and the other roles can help them. So the scientist struggles with complexity, the artist struggles with uncertainty, and the judge struggles with feelings. But the artist and scientist can help the judge with feelings, and the judge and the scientist can help the artist with uncertainty. So let me explain how. So I want to start with the judge because typically that is where we start, right? The judge really wants to maximize benefit and avoid harm. But we have to always remember help isn't helpful unless it helps, right? And so if you don't understand how a system works, which is scientists, it's going to be very difficult to know how to improve that system, right? If you don't understand what makes students get something out of education, it's going to be very hard to help them get something out of classes. If you only work with what's there, then your adaptability is limited. If we can only use classrooms once a week for a prescribed class time, right? That's very limiting. Maybe there are other ways to use the classrooms to bring people together. Maybe not all of the people from one class at one time, right? That's artist, right? We have to start thinking. But the thing that you fear also may not be the thing that you should worry about, right? So in some cases, we are afraid of sickness. But I told you guys that my wife is a transplant recipient, which means that every so often a nurse comes from a sick people's house to give her a treatment to make her more susceptible to sickness so her lung does not reject. And somehow they've been able to do that and manage it very well, which means there are ways we could do that very well too. But we just have to sort of think, is that how to do that? And is that the only thing? What about isolation? What about the experience of other students? These are the other things we need to be thinking about. Okay, so how do you find them? I actually think, and this is why I had the spiral go the way it did, we have to lead with the scientist. The first thing you should do is not give solutions, but you should be asking questions, right? And when you ask questions in a scientific way, you collect holistic data, a lot of data from about the whole problem, not just the part that you think is important. So when you lead with the scientist, you have a better basis from which to start your thinking, but then you can expand that with your artist, right? As you learn more things, your artist helps you say, maybe I'm thinking about this problem the wrong way. So I'll tell you a funny story. This is not COVID, but it's again related to COVID responses to education. I heard a lot of people, faculty, talking about how online's great, help students do this, help students do that, and it's easier for their schedule and all this other stuff. And then one time I had one of my classes, one of my team's class, do a presentation about online, do a pitch about online education. And they were all like, oh, we hate this. I was like, you do? They're like, yeah, it sucks. And they had a million reasons for why it sucked that all were things that we just hadn't thought about. I would not have known that had I not gathered the data scientifically. And then when I heard why they didn't like it, it helped my artists think, well, what could be ways to fix that problem? Okay. Similarly, we could also think about this with the economy, right? The economy is really going to be in a bad way and for a long time. But what that really means is, right, rather than just writing checks to people, like, are there other ways to compensate people? In fact, there might be, right? The online world realized that the hunt and kill, like sell what you sell at the moment, right? Like go into a store and buy something. That's a hard way to go online. Online subscription is a good way to go, right? Subscription is consistent revenue. Maybe we could do that with physical stores. Maybe restaurants could have subscriptions. Then they wouldn't have to worry about people coming in and only, like making money when people come in. This again is just artists, but it requires scientists to get it to work, but it helps because then you realize that the judge says that would help those restaurants survive. All right. We also want to help the artist imagine what might be, right? It's very hard to think outside the box, and it's even harder when there is no box. So I usually give two riddles to illustrate this. I'll just give them to you and let you puzzle them out. One is the think outside the box is a man has married 20 women in town. He's divorced none of them, but they're all still alive, yet he is not a polygamist. How is this possible? So the box you think in is about how the man can be married to the women, right? Eventually you'll get the answer, which is he married them. He's a priest, right? But it's really hard before you get that aha, like you're like, I can't figure this out, even though you know the answer very well. That's how boxes constrain your thinking. But if I remove a box and I say, explain this, a man wants to go home, but he's afraid to go home because there's a man at home wearing a mask holding something round. That's actually a much harder riddle to solve Even though there's no constraints, you could make up any story. It's very difficult to do that. If I were to say the thing that is round is a baseball, then it becomes easier because it puts constraints around what you're thinking. So we need to be able to sort of think outside the box, and that's hard, but not all ideas work and not all ideas are good. So in order to help the scientist, to help the artist, you actually have to work with the scientist and consult the judge. The scientist helps you understand how to bring what you imagine into reality. So there's a great quote by The Edge, the guitarist from U2, who talks about as he learned to play his guitar more, he was more capable of getting the sounds he imagined in his head out into the songs he was writing. And that's something you can see all over, right? The more skill you have, the more you can bring your imagination into existence. But of course, as you do that, not everything you imagine works out the way you want. And so it's important to have the judge with you to say, yeah, that didn't work. Or, oh, that almost works. I want to change the way that goes, right? So again, getting back to the idea of education and what we should be doing as we're all isolated, we should really be thinking about what is the real value of education? Is it just the content? When you ask people to think about what was important to them over college, typically it's not what I learned in a class. Typically it's an experience or some connection or some deeper developmental process that they've gone through. Believe it or not, that's artists, because it's not typically the way we think about it. And in fact, it contradicts the idea that you're here to learn content. But that's what we want to be able to bring out, and thinking about it systematically, scientists, and then thinking what really is important, judge, helps. Okay, lastly, the scientist is going to struggle to keep things simple as possible, but no simpler, right? Any idea, any solution has to work, and it's easy to become overwhelmed with information and possibilities. Believe it or not, your artist is the one who can notice what really, like, connections that weren't seen before. Every invention in history, even the ones that we rely on now that are obvious, oh, I don't know, like the wheel, or like the world is round, or like the number 0, all of these were staggering inventions at one point when somebody said, hey, I think I noticed a relationship, and that relationship might be useful. The might be useful is the second part of this, right? Scientists can build all kinds of things, but unless we can think of like what the use for that technology or innovation is, it's not going to be particularly worthwhile. So what I'm saying to you is, remember that knowledge is the beginning, not the end of wisdom, right? You collect data to be informed in your judgment, but that data doesn't determine what your judgment is. You have to use the judge, obviously, because it's a determinant. You know, the data doesn't determine what the solution is, right? And meaning and relevance are relative to what you want, right? What you want at any point in time really has to play a bigger part in how you use the information that you gather, right? So if I were to ask you the question, right, like, how do you bring about social connection? How do you bring about social connection at a distance? How do we stay connected to each other when we're on Zoom? That's a scientific problem that starts out with understanding why it is that my Zoom dinners suck, and why even for some reason, if I'm sitting 6 feet apart from my friends, it's better. That's an empirical question, and one we need to figure out, right? All right. The last couple of things I want to talk about, which is what I call the role exclusion, right? Sometimes we just use 2 of the functions and not the third, and that brings about problems too. So there's 3 fallacies, each of which correspond to missing one of the roles. My favorite is this one, probably because I identify with the artist, the fallacy of best practices. To me, this is the bureaucrat, the skilled judge who dismisses anything that is new and doesn't exist already, right? There was an old joke, right, like about like they say an economist, right? But it's the same, it actually represents the same thing. Somebody who is certain that the world is rational and exists in the way we all should see it. They walk by a $10 bill and they don't pick it up, and someone says, hey, a $10 bill, and he says, nah, it's counterfeit. They say, how do you know? He's like, oh, if it was real, someone would have picked it up already, right? That's bureaucratic thinking, right? That's no imagination. And we always need to understand that every best practice is only best with what we know right now. You know, used to think that kids needed to sleep on their backs. Then we thought they needed to sleep on their stomachs. Now we think they need to sleep on their backs. This isn't people not knowing what they're doing. It's as they get more evidence, what is best changes. And all right, see, look, I told you. What did I tell you? I told you this would happen. Anyway, so when you hear people say, well, we know what the best thing to do is because all these other people are doing it, or we've tested it, remember that every test has flaws and every theory is flawed as well, right? So things are only best until we discover better ways of doing them, right? And seemingly, we don't want to be caught with getting improved means to unimproved ends, right? So again, if you think about it, we can improve the way we interrelate over Zoom, but if ultimately we really want to be in each other's presence, that would be improved means to unimproved ends. So we always want to sort of think about the solutions that are escaping our current framework. The artist is critical, and I think the artist is the most easily dismissed. A lot of people have been asking sort of questions about how do we maintain that creativity. It's challenging because we're in a society that is really risk averse, ironically, right? And we're in a society that is really like wants the data to prove it. And the fact is that most things that are innovations, the current data don't prove it, right? So we have to sort of really sort of put effort into sort of bringing the artist out. Similarly, as we're doing that, yes and is not a workable strategy. Yes and is the discoverer or the scientist artist who gets upset by the judge because the judge bringing them over, man, with all their like negativity. And you need to realize that, like I said, some ideas are just not good, right? And so we do have to sort of say, I think that was a good idea, but it turns out it's not. Amusingly, when I was writing my book on creativity, every really creative, like music producers who I talked to, anyone who thought that like all ideas were good, they said didn't know what the hell they were doing, right? An expert creator has a good sense of knowing when they should give up on things. So as I say, put your big kid pants on and believe that your artist will make more ideas and your scientist will work with them. You can't imagine what you can't imagine, which is why you need to keep sort of fumbling around and trying. And then when you find problems, even though it was hard to come up with that creative idea, just fix it. Fix those problems, scientist and judge. And then the last thing is to think that novices are the solution. This is sort of the visionary who doesn't like the scientist's negative attitude. Yes, novices do sometimes come up with new solutions, but the fact is that most ideas are wrong, and most of the people who are experts had those same ideas when they were novices too. So the proof is in the pudding. So whether it's a novice or an expert who comes up with an idea, right? Like you really need expertise in how a system works before you're able to actually fix anything, right? We can't fix COVID without knowing how COVID works. And that's scientific empirical question. And so my thing is, like, when you're thinking about what might be, swap what is possible for what's likely, right? Lots of things could work. Go for what you think probably will work. That's just a better strategy. So last slide, it's a process. You know, wicked problems evolve and you have to evolve with it, right? Remember that the role that's driving changes, right? An artist may be leading at one point, your scientist may have to take over at another, then the judge, and it may swap back and forth. But you're almost always using at least two, if not three, in this process. And critically, do not use one to do the work of the other. Do not use the artist as the judge, or the worse, the judge is the scientist, right? Like, just don't do that. That is the road to disaster. And with that, I wonder how many of you remember this, but I know the old folks like me do. So thank you all. And now I guess I will open it up for questions as is moderated by Dr. Usher.